My name is Theron Cook, and I'm a student at the Princeton Theological Seminary in the Master of Divinity program, class of 2016.
And hello, my name is Karen Bachman, and I am in the same program at the seminary.
The following interviews are part of a special project of our class, Islam in America, led by Professor Richard Fox Young. The purpose of our project was to gain the reactions and analysis of local Muslim leaders about the myriad issues raised regarding the future of Islam captured in the documentary called Unmosqued that aired in Princeton on March 29, 2014.
According to the film's director, Ahmed Aid, Unmosqued is a documentary film that focuses on the need for reform in many of our mosques in America. The film follows the story of a group of people who are unhappy with the status quo at their mosque and decide to reform it by trying to get elected to their leadership. The film discusses women and the spaces they occupy, converts and the new struggles they face, mosque stewardship, and then some of the third spaces that have emerged in reaction to the situations in the mosque. Based on statistics found in the mosque studies of 2011, Unmosqued aims to be a conversation starter for communities that wish to better their mosques.
In April, we interviewed 2 local imams to get their analyses of the specific issues raised in Unmosqued and their wider views toward the future of Islam in America. We hope you enjoy the results.
Okay. Hello, Sammy, and welcome and thank you for participating in this special project for our class, Islam in America, at Princeton Theological Seminary. My name is Karen Bachman, and I will be conducting the interview. My colleague, Theron Cook, will be managing the technology to record our session. So please, would you first introduce yourself?
Yes, it's an honor to be here. My name is Sami Kadovic, and I'm the Executive Director of the New Brunswick Islamic Center in BIC, located in North Brunswick, New Jersey.
And how long have you been associated with that?
In that position or in that capacity for approximately 8 months now.
Good, good, thank you. So you know that the purpose of our interview is to gain your reaction and your thoughts about the issues raised regarding the future of Islam in America as set forth in the controversial documentary film Unmosqued, recently aired in Princeton. According to the film's producers, it was created to highlight a growing need for reform in many mosques throughout the United States. The producers hope to start a conversation that helps people at the mosque reconnect with their leaders and explore the reasons that have led to this sense of a need for reform and perhaps be a catalyst for positive change. The film suggests that the following elements are the drivers of the need for change: the growing younger generation of second-generation U.S. Muslims and their interest in leadership, mosque leadership, a sense of a lack of inclusiveness and lack of openness within a mosque community, a desire for equity within diversity, a desire for opportunities for public service as a Muslim, and fiscal transparency. We might not get to all of those issues today, but we'll see what we can cover in the amount of time that we've allotted here. So, shall we begin?
Sure.
All right, good. First, we'll talk about, the film suggests that although there are now over 2,000 mosques in the United States, which is an increase of 74% since 2000, according to CARE, there appears to be either a quasi-exodus of Muslims from the mosque or a growing number of Muslims in the U.S. that have never participated at a mosque, or that new converts to Islam are not going to the mosque to worship. Rather, they're choosing to worship at home or in other types of community gatherings. The film suggests this is especially true of women and younger, or so-called the millennial generation of U.S.-born Muslims. So my question to you is, have you observed a decline in mosque attendance? And if so, what do you think might be driving that?
I mean, I think the statistics show in terms of the growth of the mosque is because there's the growth of the community at large. In my experience, parking is always an issue at every mosque that I generally go to, especially for the Friday services. So I don't know necessarily if there's a decrease in attendance in most mosques, at least the ones that I've gone to. They all seem to be maxed out, at least on those important days. I think, though, the deeper question or the more nuanced question is looking to who is attending. And you know, you have these waves of immigration here when we're talking about the immigrant Muslim experience in America. And so I think the issue is, are the mosques being filled with recent immigrants who were plugged into the mosques that were built by the older immigrant generation or the earlier immigrant generation? Or are they being populated by children who were born and raised within those communities? Are they returning to the mosque?
Okay.
So I don't know if there's been a sufficient amount of statistics or studies done on that, of who is specifically attending and where those, if they are gone, that second generation or third generation.
Right.
Anecdotally, yes, I think there is, that I've noticed, based on any study, that you will find that a lot of times that it's the more recent immigrant population who seems to be populating those mosques, and oftentimes, at least those who were raised in that particular mosque, you know, when they were young as children, went through Sunday school, this sort of thing, that oftentimes maybe they are not as present as people would hope for. So I think that's sort of where the issue is. It's not necessarily the numbers. The numbers are there. The question is, though, are those numbers sufficient for, you know, people who have been born and raised in that community to have retained their connection to that center?
Okay, okay. So you don't see that really being driven by any other of the drivers that we've suggested so far? There's really nothing showing that?
No, I think that that's probably those things you mentioned are probably responsible for that, the second generation not coming in due to maybe lack of inclusiveness, relevance, you know, to everyday life situations that they're facing. You know, not feeling necessarily valued as much maybe in the mosque structure, in terms of organizational structure, as they would in, you know, the world at large. Those issues I think come into play, and that may, like I said, result in Unmosqued sort of touches on this, that why many of these, or it seems like many of these people are not connecting to the mosques or to the centers that they once, you know, were a part of.
Well, that leads us right to our next question then. Perfect segue, thank you for that. The film does reiterate this belief that the mosque is the backbone of the community, backbone of the Muslim community, and then highlights a number of barriers. So we might be, let's look at some of those barriers that might be keeping people away from the mosque and thereby maybe missing out on the benefits of being part of a community. And the first barrier that identified in the film is this idea of the separation of men and women. I mean, it's an easy one to pick out, where women may be assigned to inferior or even unwelcoming spaces to worship. Does the mosque you attend separate men and women in worship? And if so, in what way? And if you could talk about why that might be, a couple of suggestions would be, is it a religious requirement? Is it a cultural preference? Someone suggested, is it necessary for a harmonious community? Or there are other reasons. So what's your opinion on that?
I think just to clarify in terms of when we say separation from worship, so religiously, in terms of the ritual worship, the 5 daily prayers, the Friday prayers, there is a religiously mandated separation in terms of physical separation between men and women. That women pray behind the men due to certain requirements of motions in the worship, etc. As well as this is, you know, taught by our prophet to do it that way. So that's one thing. So that's the ritual aspect. There is a separation. You will find that in nearly any mosque you go to. The second issue would be then, I think, that where mosques may differ, and I think that the film was trying to highlight, is those in which there is a lack of equal access to worship space within the center itself. That in some of the mosques they showed in the film, you know, that either women weren't welcome, they're in the back closet, they're, you know, on the second floor, you know, some small area, whatever it is that they had profiled. And that, I think, is sort of the crux of the discussion or the issue that the film was trying, I think, to highlight. At the center I'm at, no, I mean, we don't have a barrier, we don't have a curtain between men and women, that you may find in some other communities. So there's equal access to the worship space for a woman, except during prayer. And even in prayer, there's the same access to the worship space. We pray in one hall, in one room, with no barrier. The barriers are more reflective of culture.
Okay.
From many cultures you will find, or many areas of the Muslim world you will find that they may have implemented certain barriers, or maybe not even welcoming people into the mosque, especially a woman into the mosque, based on cultural or social, historical reasons, what have you. But those mosques, I mean, we're not doing it because we're in America. That's not in terms of the leadership of our mosque. We're doing it because we believe this follows the prophetic model, that at the Prophet's time there was no barrier between men and women. They had the same worship space, the same access to the worship space, and the same access to the community leadership. So without getting into sort of what created these barriers and social circumstances and historical circumstances, we feel there's no need to carry those over. In fact, we feel that it's preferable not to even bother, because the prophetic model was something else.
Right.
There may have been legitimate reasons historically why these things happen, my personal view of that, but nonetheless, that's, where we are at. Unfortunately, though, that view is not necessarily shared by all mosques in the United States or all communities, and I think the film highlighted some of those. In Islam, it's mandated that men and women have equal responsibilities before God, and therefore that requires, in terms of prayer and community involvement and spiritual development, and so that they should be provided, as far as we're concerned, that space to develop as well too.
And how are your, I'll use the word congregants because that's a phrase that's familiar to me, but I'm sure you know what I mean, but your worshiping participants, how are they responding to that?
It's interesting, because we're a very mixed community, diverse community. On the whole, it's welcome. It's a breath of fresh air for many of our congregants, and many come there, or have shared that with us, that's why they do come, especially obviously for a woman. But we do occasionally get, maybe certain culturally, what I would call culturally defined Muslims who will occasionally raise the issue, you're going to put up a barrier, you're going to put up a curtain. And, we try to educate them, explain to them, because they're coming from a culture in which they assumed this was the case. And so it takes a little bit of education, sitting with them and explaining to them, going through the sources, that this is not mandated by the religion, and in fact, it's probably not even endorsed by it. But and so that just takes time, just educating the community. People are in a new world, and they oftentimes rely on what they know and what they brought with them as that sense of security, or that which grounds them in the sort of multifaceted, multicultural, multi-religious world that they're in. So.
And then not to leave them feeling more uncomfortable than they need to.
Right,
because
exactly.
of misunderstanding. Yes. Yeah, interesting. Another barrier that the film brought up is a culture, and the film raised the question about the role of the mosque as a place of faith or a place of culture, or both. And I think there are a lot of nuances in a question like that. And just picking up on some of the things mentioned, like mosques in the United States tend to develop around a cultural group. So you might see a mosque that's largely Pakistani, or largely Egyptian, or largely African American. So in a sense, they take on a culture, if only for the demographics. And then it's really difficult to differentiate between the faith practices and cultural practices. An example may be religious dress, where we might recognize religious dress being a mark of religious piety. But on the other hand, the mark of piety may have become something that's been adapted by the culture. So how do you separate the two? Another example, and I heard this from someone else, you can enter a mosque in New Jersey and feel transported to Egypt, and then feel obligated to adhere to the cultural norms of that immigrant Egyptian congregation, but otherwise it's not really in any way aligned to your everyday cultural experience. If this phenomenon is true, as raised by the film, should the mosque play a role in either encouraging this or discouraging that? And if in either way, what does that do as far as the non-immigrant U.S. Muslim?
Yes, I think the film was accurate, or did an accurate depiction of many mosques, although I think are becoming less frequent than maybe what was in the 80s, or in terms of when I was growing up, you would see this much more pronounced. My father used to always refer to them as the homesick mosques.
Okay.
That people were going there, again, coming as new immigrants, and trying to connect with something of back home.
Sure.
And so they created their own little world, not necessarily in clubs or cultural centers, but maybe they were religious, so they created it within the mosque structure. In terms of dress and food, and even then religious practice became also imported as well. So I think it depends on the mindset of whoever opened up that mosque, or started it to begin with. One of the things that I don't know people always appreciate or realize, that many Muslims, when they came here, did not come here thinking long term. They came, especially when we're talking about the immigrant population who had come, but so they came as students, many of them, and then they just happened to get married, and they had families, etc. But they stayed, it seems like, in that mindset that one day they're going back home. That they didn't necessarily make that transition over. So if they didn't make that transition over, then what they're seeking for in a mosque is going to be something completely different than somebody who makes a decision that they're going to live here in the United States, and this is, the beginning point of future generations. So I think that's where the conflict or the issue is coming out in communities. What's happened with a lot of immigrant communities who came with this mindset is, it's been 20, 30 years now, you've been here, I don't think you're going back home. And your children, don't have those cultural links.
Right.
So some of them may have come to the realization maybe a little too late in terms of maybe alienating their children because of the cultural aspect, which the children were not able to fully embrace. And unfortunately, if that was mixed with the religious element, then it could be a rejection of both simultaneously. I never really appreciated that aspect either, because my father, when he had come to this country, came with a different mindset, that this was his home.
Okay.
So that's how we started, and that's how we were raised from day one. But many around us did not have that understanding. But I had spent a year in Saudi Arabia, and I've studied in other parts of the Middle East over the years for some extended periods of time. And I began to appreciate that mindset because I wasn't going there to establish myself. That was my consciousness from the beginning. And therefore, how what I tried to do, to sustain something of my own cultural identity, or with my family and my children, was different than what I would necessarily do here, because I was seeking a different goal. And I found actually a lot of expatriates, it's interesting, although they were born and raised here, so many of them, they're in this now mindset where they thought it was going to be 2 or 3 years. I mean, I only spent a year and I came back. But they were planning on 2 or 3 years there, and all of a sudden it's 20 years later,
Right.
they're still in this mindset of, this isn't home and I got to come back.
Right.
And due to a lot of immigration policies of these countries, they don't have a choice anyway. I mean, it's just the nature. But America sort of being unique, that no roots can be established here. So I think that's sort of where the problem lied for a lot of these communities that came. They wanted to build these centers that were as a taste of back home, and that they weren't necessarily able to evaluate what was culturally necessary, what was culturally beneficial maybe for their own identity, and what was religiously mandated. And so they have gone through sort of development, I think over the years, maybe a little bit bit slow in the process of coming to the realization that things have to change. If your goal is to establish, a Muslim identity beyond your own generation,
Right.
but for future generations, then a shift has to take place.
So it's going to naturally,
I-
because of just the way the family itself develops, so that will change.
Yeah,
The mosque.
the only way I see it will not is if there's a new wave of immigrants who are coming with the same mentality.
Okay.
But in terms of second generation sort of coming in and stepping up, they're generally, at least what I find in working with young people, they're not willing to embrace the whole cultural
Right.
experience of back home because it has maybe many facets of it have no relationship here. So there's a beautiful aspect of walking
Yes.
into Egypt and walking through, and I grew up with that. And that was beneficial in many ways because I got to experience so many cultures and peoples. It's interesting when I had made the pilgrimage, for example, in Mecca. You find you'll see a white Muslim and an American, everybody wants a picture. And I found myself, in a lot of pictures. I don't know
Right.
where these albums are going to be.
Look, Mom.
But it struck me this last time that I had gone, this always happened, it's, my family, whatever, people who are curious. I didn't have that curiosity.
Mm-hmm.
And it kind of struck me. I wanted to take something home to,
Right.
and it struck me because I've been exposed to all of representations of all of these people. So there was nothing sort of a novelty or something, very interesting. It's the first time that I've come across somebody of that particular culture or something of that sort. And I think that's why I wasn't so interested in capturing random pictures of people from different parts of the world because I had already seen them.
Right.
So there was a beauty in that too. But like I said, it's the challenge I think for these masajid communities as a whole is trying to make that shift. Because once you make that shift, then you see things completely
Right.
differently. How you're going to deal with your children, what you believe the mosque should provide.
Sure.
Just the idea of the mosque itself. In many of these countries, the mosque serves only the spiritual development of the person
Right.
for prayers, and that's it.
And not any of the other extra
Nothing else.
community type
Education is somewhere else, right?
Right.
Maybe you'll have a class here and there in a mosque overseas,
Sure.
but in general, it's not done there. It's done in other locations. Social activities are somewhere else,
Mhm.
etc. So there's people come here with that understanding of the mosque that's sort of culturally defined in their own country.
Yes.
It's not going to work here because there aren't those other avenues to help maintain someone's religious identity institutionally structured here in the country. So the mosque becomes, what's becoming now more common is the idea of the Islamic center
Mhm. Yes.
being beyond that, that it's trying to satisfy not only spiritual needs, but also the social and educational needs of its communities. But if, again, communities are not willing to do that and want to treat a mosque only or solely for spiritual development, they're leaving then their community to find other avenues in which they may lose their identity that they're hoping to preserve to begin with.
Well, I think that actually leads us well into the next question again, because that requires leadership. If that's going to happen and happen over the right kind of course of time, that somebody's helping to massage that along, right? So leadership being another one of the barriers identified in the film, talking about leadership that can be a barrier to gender, a barrier to ethnicity, and as I put in our script, the age-old problem of the generation gap, which you've already brought up some of the issues associated with that already. The film raised the idea about female representation on the boards, especially of what you would have an Islamic center, not necessarily just a mosque for worship. I think of that more in the term of the center. This was an interesting phrase, if you remember, they called whiteheads versus blackheads, describing both generational issues, the old and the young, as well as ethnicity, immigrant versus U.S. born. And again, there's this idea of the millennial generation in the U.S. being, and I think this is an interesting statistic, being the most ethnically diverse cohort in history, which also then brings with it so many different aspects of what has to be done. So is today's mosque leadership that you're seeing it, considering how to keep that generation or anything associated with these types of barriers of leadership, who might seek alternatives unless leadership create something that has them want to stay?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I think those communities or those mosque leaderships who established the communities in the last 30, 40 years, if they've made that shift, then they may be having these discussions. The problem is, or the challenge I feel that a lot of them face, they sacrificed a lot to do what they did. And as a result, it's difficult to let go of the child, that they maybe created for somebody else to take over. So that element is there. They also came, I think, with leadership. There's always two sides to this, because while there's maybe an issue of preventing access, there's also the issue of people stepping up.
Okay.
So
that's fair.
That's
Yes.
the two sides of the coin. What I find in terms of people in my generation, that the older generation had that many don't have in my generation, is the urgency. So where the immigrant population, when they came, it was them or nothing. That's how they viewed it, and that's how I think they were able to, dedicate so much of their time and money, et cetera, to building these centers. Now, because we grew up with these already established buildings and centers, there's a lot of my generation who don't feel that sense of urgency. It will always be there. It was always there.
Right.
And then to compound that, when they try to get involved, then yes, oftentimes they're hitting hard walls in terms of the old generation having a certain perspective of how things should be done. But it is a problem. I mean, for women leadership in mosques, for example, and sitting on boards, and the film did hit on that. Because of the presence of certain strong cultural views, this is very difficult for a lot of people to allow that in.
Right.
The problem is you have very qualified women who are respected for their corporate world here, there, and the world around them, and they're coming to the mosque and then sort of relegated to a back seat. This doesn't sit well, and that's why a lot of them maybe may feel disenchanted of even coming to the mosque or wanting to participate. Similarly with younger generation, people who have achieved a lot in the world at large go to the mosque and are dealing with sort of petty politics over things that are minutia or they feel as a minutia. And so I wouldn't say they withdraw in terms of like mosque participation, but they don't involve themselves in the running of the mosque. So I find a lot of my generation are just have their families, things settled. Mosque provides their Sunday school and their worship service, they go and that sort of thing. But don't feel that responsibility always, or that burden of responsibility to take on the leadership. It's just sort of assumed it will always be there.
So what would you say, since we're going to have a few minutes to wind up, and that really takes it to you and someone that is maybe in between, you are serving a leadership role, and what would you say to others to re-encourage that interest, or what do if you wanted to, if we said what's your personal view and attitude about the future of Islam in America, is that has to become part of that, or what do you think?
I mean, I think it's up to the second generation to be mature enough in terms of engaging and the mosque communities, even those that may be difficult to deal with, leadership, and to contribute to or the overall running of the centers, without necessarily being disrespectful to the sacrifices that were made. And that's, I think, sort of where sometimes we can get a little too anxious and presumptuous on our part. That if we can maintain that interaction, I think that the future is hopeful. But there has to be an understanding of the communities and the leadership, whoever takes that leadership, that in order for Islam to survive, that shift has to take place. Islam has an amazing ability of adapting to cultures and civilizations, and has done this successfully throughout the world. And that if it's going to adapt here, it has to be with that understanding that Muslims are part and parcel of the American experience, and that has to be understood by the Muslims themselves. And until that shift takes place, we'll still have these problems. Yes, the mosque may be populated, but it will be always populated by someone new. And so, if we're looking for long-term generational continuity, I think we need to make that shift, or communities need to make that shift to achieve that.
So in our last minute that we have here, your overall take on the whole purpose for Unmosqued and what they're trying to do. Are you supportive of that? Do you think the more the better that as an audience to take on this conversation? What do you think?
Yeah, I think the film had some shortcomings. There was a lot of artistic license, and definitely in terms of how things are portrayed and for dramatic effect. And things are always a little more nuanced and not as black and white. But I thought it did a good job of raising the questions, raising the issues. That controversial nature of it, I think, is good for conversation. And I think it's a good starting point that mosques should be engaging this and seeing, what are they doing some of the things that are being pointed out, which seem to be problematic? Why are they problematic? And let them have those conversations internally. So I commend them for doing that and trying to get the conversation going, especially for in many communities, and encourage mosques to show this to their community and then have that discussion and that debate, because it may be asking questions or raising issues that people never even conceived of as an issue or a problem to begin with. And then if they start asking those serious questions themselves and do internal reflection, that may cause the stimulus for change.
Good. Well, thank you very much,
Thank
Stan.
you.
Really appreciate this. I think we could have gone on for a very long time, but I really appreciate your input.
Thank you.
Yes. Hello, and I want to say, is it Sohaib? Sohaib and Arshi? Yes. Thank you. Welcome and thank you for participating in this special project for our class, Islam in America, at Princeton Theological Seminary. My name is Karen Bachman, and I will be conducting the interview. My colleague is Theron Cook, and he will be managing the technology to record our session. Would you please begin by each introducing yourselves?
I'm Sohaib Sultan. I serve as the Muslim chaplain, Muslim life coordinator here at Princeton University. I've been at the university for about 6 years now.
My name is Arshi. I work with the Muslim Life Program hand in hand with my husband, so I come to campus. I've given myself a title of the glorified volunteer, but some people call me co-chaplain, which is a lofty term, but I am around the students and I help with the program.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. So we will begin by explaining the purpose of this interview is to gain your reactions and thoughts about the issues raised regarding the future of Islam in America in the controversial documentary film Unmosqued, recently aired at Princeton. According to the film's producers, it was created to highlight a growing need for reform in many mosques throughout the United States. The producers hope to start a conversation that helps the people at the mosque reconnect with their leaders and explore the reasons that have led to this sense of a need for reform and perhaps be a catalyst for positive change. The film suggests that the following elements are the drivers of the need for change: the growing younger generation of second-generation U.S. Muslims and their interest in mosque leadership, a sense of a lack of inclusiveness and lack of openness within a mosque community, a desire for equity within diversity, a desire for opportunities for public service as a Muslim, and fiscal transparency. So shall we begin? Good, good. First question. The film suggests that although there are now over 2,000 mosques in the United States, that's an increase of 74% since 2000, according to CARE, there appears to be either a quasi-exodus of Muslims from the mosque or a growing number of Muslims in the U.S. that have never participated at a mosque, or that new converts to Islam are not going to the mosque to worship. Rather, they are choosing to worship at home or in other types of community settings. The film suggests this is especially true of women and younger millennials, U.S. Muslims of that generation. So my question is, have you observed a decline in mosque attendance, and if so, what do you think is driving that decline?
It's interesting because our own ministry is here at the university on a college campus. And inevitably, we too end up having a lot of our worship life on a college campus as well. So when we do, on those occasions, go to mosque, it is usually for the Friday prayer, if I've been invited as a special preacher, or there's a special circumstance where you don't have to be on campus. And what's interesting in those experiences is that almost every mosque that we've been to, rather than seeing so few people, it's kind of overwhelming how many number of people there are. But I think that there's something very particular about the Friday prayer, and the fact that people just pour in from wherever they might be living, wherever they might be working. And also there's the reality that the Friday prayer is seen as an obligation, so even people who feel disaffected or disenfranchised by the mosque culture, they will nonetheless, kind of overlook that to make their obligatory prayer, which usually happens in a mosque setting. But then the larger question of what's their relationship to the mosque and how regularly do they go to the mosque, that's where we probably see the decline in numbers or the fewer numbers.
And then I was going to ask if that was the case, then if the numbers were not declining, were they, or the attendance that's occurring, has the makeup of that mosque group of attendees changed or stayed the same?
I think it's hard to say depending on the area.
Right.
So
Right.
I think we've also transitioned in our lives. He grew up in Indiana, I grew up in New York, we shifted to Connecticut, we've been in New Jersey. So it depends on the mosque setting, how big it is, what the demographics are. So it's hard to tell, but the one thing I wanted to add was that I feel like as people are getting more settled in, they feel like they have a voice or they want to have a voice. So I think even if they felt disenfranchised before, maybe they weren't speaking up, but maybe now, as and especially in a post 9/11 world where you have to speak or be spoken for, maybe that comes out as well as wanting to have a voice in saying like how does this space work, and what are the rights of people who attend.
Well, good, because that actually leads me to my next question. And I think the film does reiterate the belief that the mosque is the backbone of the community. So you talk about having voices, and then highlights a number of barriers that may be keeping people away from the mosque, and thereby missing out really on the benefits of the community. And so let's cover a couple of those barriers brought out. The first barrier identified is the separation of men and women, where women may be assigned to inferior places or even unwelcoming spaces in worship. So as you see it, the mosques that you have been attending, and maybe even talk about what happens here at the university about separating men and women in worship, and if that's done, in what way might it be done, and what reasons could be. For instance, it might be religious preference, religious requirements, what we do. It may be a cultural preference. People have asked to have it done that way. Maybe it's necessary for a harmonious community, or there may be other reasons. What do you think?
So to begin with, what we've typically seen is that it's very atypical. Whichever mosque you go to, you'll see different things. Sometimes you'll see the men in front, the women behind them. You'll find sometimes women are in the basement and men are on the top floor. Sometimes you'll find women in the balcony space and men on the main floor. And in a very few occasions, we've also seen side by side where there's like a big gap in the middle, but men are on the side and women on the side. So we've seen quite a bit of diversity in terms of, and really the issue is that it's oftentimes it's a question of functionality. And what's definitely established in the tradition and part of Islamic prayer ritual is that men and women are to be in separate spaces when they are praying. But the large space can be the same, but they pray separately. But then over time, I think that that question of functionality became a question of piety. So people started saying that if you have a barrier and the women can't see the men and the men can't see the women, that's somehow a conservative pietistic tradition. And the more you open it, it's more of a liberal position. So people started having these type of attitudes. But I think what a lot of people are trying to reclaim is what was done during the time of the Prophet Muhammad. And during the time of the Prophet Muhammad, what we do know is that there was a very open space between men and women, and that women did pray behind men. That's always been established in that prayer ritual tradition. But they've always been in the same space, and that there's always been a very open, open dynamic there. And I think a lot of people are saying they want to reclaim that.
Interesting. Just to say reclaiming history.
Reclaiming history.
Yes.
Yeah, it's not a liberalization.
Right.
but rather it's a reclaiming of what was
Good.
in that prophetic era.
And that brings up the second barrier identified as one of culture, and you mentioned that. Sometimes it's more culturally what has been a practice over time. The film raises the question about the role of the mosque. Is it a place of faith, a place of culture, or both? And many mosques in the United States tend to have developed around a cultural group. As we've seen, you can go to a mosque and you find it might be largely Pakistani, or it might be largely African American, or some other cultural group. So faith practices and cultural practices are difficult to differentiate. And for example, they show cultural norms regarding appropriate dress. May be a mark of religious piety, but then it becomes, this mark of piety becomes identified as being cultural, a dress style of culture. Or another example was, you might enter a mosque in New Jersey and feel transported to Egypt. And then you may feel obligated to adhere to the cultural norms of that immigrant Egyptian congregation, but otherwise it's not anything that you are usually accustomed to playing a role in. So the question, if this is a phenomenon, if this is the way the mosques are working, this idea of culture versus religion, should the mosque play a role in encouraging that or discouraging that? And then the follow-up question that goes with that is, if that is keeping the non-immigrant U.S. Muslims away from the mosque, or should they be developing or endeavoring to develop their own mosque? So it's kind of a two-part question there.
I mean, I think I'll just start off by saying that, culture is relevant. Culture, we all come from different cultures. It's part and parcel of our identity. So it's so hard to differentiate culture from faith, because it's one thing for each person. It's part and parcel of their lives. But having said that, I think when certain cultural norms become the way or the only way, or become the norm by what people have to live by, that's where it gets a little bit tough and frustrating. And I think as not only the non-immigrants or the converts, but also the second generation Muslims who are born and raised in this country, they're finding their own culture and norms, right? So they're of an ethnic background, but they're also Americans, so they're bringing this American culture into the mix as well. I mean, these things have to be negotiated. I think conversations have to be had on a lot of these topics, on how are things to be done, what makes people uncomfortable, what are the limits, how far can we push certain ideas and trends. So I think these are all good conversations to be had, and I think it's prime time for that.
Yeah. And I think that, as Arshi was saying, culture and religion just inherently have this mix, because anytime you bring religion, which is a set of principles and values, to a community of people, it's going to intermix with the culture of that people, right? And so there's no mosque that is cultureless. Every mosque has its own culture, but the question is, one, is a particular culture stressed as much as you would stress those religious principles and values? Mm-hmm. So, if I may be in a mosque that has a predominant Pakistani culture, and if that means that after Friday prayers there's biryani and other Pakistani food, that's one thing. But if they insist that I dress like a Pakistani in order to be considered a religious Muslim, then that's where it becomes a problem. Okay. And the other thing that I would say is that it's fine that there are mosques that might be predominantly one culture or another. That's just kind of, I think, the natural history and transition of religious spaces in America. But I think alongside that, you also have to have mosques that are open enough to develop a uniquely Muslim American culture, where American culture is seen as just as valuable or just as acceptable as Pakistani American culture. Mm-hmm. And just as you have a mosque that has Pakistani culture, you should also be able to have a mosque that has, American culture. Those aspects of American culture that are, of course, in line with the sacred tradition. Right.
Good. Another barrier mentioned is the question of barriers associated with gender, ethnicity, which I think we've just talked about, and the age-old problem of the generation gap. And of course, being on the university campus, you are really tuned in to younger generations of Muslims, whether they are here as foreign students or here as American-born Muslims. A couple of things that pointed out in the documentary: female representation on boards of mosques and community centers are a significant focus, I think, of the film. The film uses this phrase, whitehead versus blackheads, to talk about the generational issues, old to young, but also ethnicity issues, immigrant versus U.S. born. And of course, the millennial generation in the U.S. may be the most ethnically diverse cohort in U.S. history, which I was surprised to learn. Is today's mosque leadership, as you see it, considering how to keep that generation from seeking alternatives to the mosque or not, or if they're seeking other spaces?
I think sadly too many mosques are not thinking ahead. They're not envisioning what the future will look like without the founders of the mosques.
Mm-hmm.
And oftentimes the founders of the mosque, we value their contribution, but we know that they're getting older, and inevitably there will have to come change. And my fear is that that change will be very unnatural, because there isn't this long-term vision of mentoring in the next generation of Muslim leaders. People are still wanting to hold on to what was and hold on to their positions. I think there's this mistrust between generations. The older generation doesn't trust the younger generation thinks the older generation is outdated. And there's not enough conversation going on between them, and enough transition that is being planned. So I worry greatly about the transition of leadership in most of these mosques, and it's not being done in a very healthy way in most of the mosques, unfortunately.
Do you see the students that you are interacting with here in the university going to these third spaces that might be found available to them through social media or other types of community centers? Do you see them becoming involved or being drawn to that in any way? Some of the things that they've talked about are models such as Makespace in Washington, and then other social media outlets that have become more and more popular.
I think this, obviously when the students are here, the Office of Religious Life and what we provide, that's their home and studying. Those are the two things I think in their heads. But as they graduate, and we've kept in touch with many of them, it's a tough time. It's a very transitory time where they're not married, they don't have families, so they're in this interesting space, and we talk to them about what is their community, and they're searching and they're trying to find that place. And places like Makespace, they're still unique. They're one in so many. They're few and far in between. So I think people do try to get together for social events, or they try to get together for educational activities, but it's just few and far in between, and I think people are still trying to figure out how to create spaces like that to fill that void of faith and community as they transition.
I think also mosques are not doing a good job, of providing for that particular age group. That when you graduate from college, most mosques don't even think about the college graduates. They think about those who are young. So there's all these activities for kids.
Right.
There's these activities for maybe married couples and things like that. There's always this expectation that, you come with your family. If the mosque is oriented toward community, then it's going to be family. But what if you don't have a family? What if you're just living for a few years doing an internship or a job in some place, who's catering to your specific needs? So I think that the mosques need to be more catered to the needs of that specific age group, and need to engage them in new and creative ways, and also to use their experiences. What I find sad is that too often people are really active on college campus in their Muslim community, and then a few years later I follow up with them and they're not involved in any community, and I'm like, wow, they learned so much as Muslim leaders on college campuses, and they're not able to take that anywhere because the mosques, either the mosques are not open to it, or the students themselves get bogged down in work and professional life.
Right, which is
So it
understandable.
goes both ways.
Well, that actually, I think, works well for the next topic, because if they feel that they were so active when they were at university and then haven't found that, one of the benefits of belonging to a faith-based community is the opportunity to participate in organized acts of community service. And I think my experience with millennials is something that's very much of an interest to them. And so you can have community service with other people who share your same values. And if second generation American Muslims are staying away from the mosque because it's not an environment in which they feel included, for whatever those reasons are, is there a risk that they downplay and perhaps even hide their Muslim identity in order to more comfortably participate in non-mosque-centered acts of service, and thereby lose the opportunity to witness to the world about Islam and the values? There's a lot of things loaded into that question, but I mean, what are some of your thoughts on that?
You know, it's an interesting question because I do know that, you know, a lot of times when people go out to do service, they're inspired by their faith to do it, but they won't articulate that. They won't express it. They're not going to wear it on their sleeves. And one, because they don't want to push their religion down other people's throats. And two, because there's some trepidation about how that will be received, you know. And so even actually here on campus, I remember that when we started establishing relationships between the Office of Religious Life and the PACE Center for Civic Engagement, you know, there were certain people in PACE who were kind of like, you know, surprised that so many students they were working so closely with for many, many years were actually very devoted to their faith, and that they were inspired by their faith to do acts of service, but they never articulated that or never expressed it. And even directors at the PACE Center were surprised to kind of find that out.
Yes.
You know, so I think that happens outside of university campuses.
So to get your overall impressions, when you look at the purpose and goals that I talked about earlier for the producers of Unmosqued, are they on the right track? Are they somewhat tipping off the right kinds of discussions? Would you support that or not? What are your overall impressions?
I mean, I would wholeheartedly support their endeavors. I think they're definitely on the right track. I mean, you see a problem, one of the things that you do is you talk about it, and I think they've created this documentary as a stepping stone. We know both of them personally, so we'll put that out there as well. You know, they're good friends of ours, and they're genuine people, they're sincere people, they're godly people, you know, they have faith in their religion, they have faith in people, and they grew up in the mosque setting, so they want to claim that and have that to be a place for not only for themselves but for other people who are struggling. So I think it's a great endeavor and start of the conversation, and it's led, you know, like this Unmosqued, it became a hashtag as well, and there have been other hashtags that have been in response to it where people say be mosqued, so trying to remosqued and be mosqued, you know, so there's like this idea, okay, let's put a positive spin, let's try to get this headed in the right direction, and they wouldn't disagree with that. They want people to claim the mosque, to claim religion, and, you know, have that part and parcel of their lives.
Yeah. I mean, they're wonderful people, and you know, I admire them greatly. And you know, they really put themselves out there because they knew that they would get a lot of criticism from the community, but I think that they really felt like it was an important conversation to have. I think they framed most of the conversations in a very healthy way. I think that if I was to offer any feedback, it would be that I don't think it's particularly helpful to talk about the immigrant versus non-immigrant divide in the way that they sometimes talked about it, and that we often find ourselves as Muslims talking about it, because I don't think it's actually about where you were born, but it's about the mentality that you carry. Because I've met too many Muslims who are born and raised in America, but have this very, you know, have this mentality that closes the community off to other people. I've met other people who have come from abroad, and they have a very open mentality toward creating open communities and open spaces. So I don't think it's about an immigrant, non-immigrant. I think it's about attitudes and about closed-mindedness versus open-mindedness, which I think is a transatlantic problem and not just a foreign versus American problem.
Good. Now finally, after setting aside everything about what the film has said, what are your personal views or attitudes about the future of Islam in America?
I mean, it's a big question. You know, in many ways, working on a college campus, I think I can't feel other than optimistic because I meet so many young Muslims who are devoted to their religion and who have such good values, and I'm just proud of them. And I see great hope in them. But at the same time, I'm also very realistic about the enormous challenges that we face as a community. We have to develop a culture that we can feel is rooted in our religion and in our Americanness. And we have to be able to embrace that. That's an internal challenge. We have to figure out how to transmit our values and our knowledge and our traditions from one generation to another in a way that's actually appealing to young people and not something that seems so alien to them. And figuring out what that will look like creatively will be an interesting challenge. So these are some of the challenges we face internally, but then also externally we face a huge challenge, which is that to this day, most Americans don't understand Islam. To this day, most Americans have a negative perception of Islam. This is, based on statistics that have been gathered. And as long as Islam is treated as a third wheel in this society, we will not be able to develop a healthy community, because a community that is under siege, a community that feels that it is not welcomed, or a community that feels that there are negative perceptions about it, will always be a community that is reactive rather than proactive. And as long as we're reactive and not proactive, we won't be able to reach our potentials.
Exactly. So thank you both very much for participating in our project. And this is the end of the interview officially at this point in time. And I just want to thank you.
Thank you for taking an interest in our engaging local Muslim leaders about the future of Islam in America, spawned by the documentary Unmosqued.
Based upon what you have just viewed, we believe it is fair to say that the Muslim community in the United States, regardless of the efforts of Unmosqued, is aware of and becoming more sensitive to the need to meet the expectations of a new generation of Muslims in America, both those born and educated here as well as new immigrants. We realize the Muslim community is not monolithic, nor is it unique in needing to transform as a result of changing demographics. But it may be unique in America, where internal change is overshadowed by external social and political pressures.
During the preparation of this project, it was our pleasure to become acquainted with Muslim leaders in central New Jersey. Our conversations with all the individuals that participated in our project were the perfect capstone to our course about Islam in America. Rather than an ending, we hope the relationships that we have initiated here are just the beginning of our dialogue with our Muslim neighbors and fellow Americans here in the Princeton, New Jersey area.